And I'm sure we're all, without exception, the sort who like to hop around country churchyards and get a lot of enjoyment from just browsing and often looking at the stones and thinking, well, that's an interesting one, or that's a nice inscription, and often wondering what the story is behind the odd anomalous inscription, shall I say. Well, I'm no different. I love it. Lynn does as well. She'd like to be here, but we'll just put the boys to bed. But it's when you see these little things, oh, that's nice, I wonder what was the story behind that, and you forget about it. But what I've tried to do is, over the last few years, when I see an interesting stone or inscription, is try to do a little research just by the side, really, to try to find out the story behind an inscription. And so really, we're only going to visit something like about a dozen graves today, that's all, in 4 churchyards, but I hope to give you some of the background behind the individual under the stone. So what I'll do, I'll start with one that I spotted 6 or 7 years ago in this churchyard, and we're just over there. If you follow me, it's underneath a yew tree, but we can get round and pull a complete circle really, because you don't need to see the inscription, I can read it out to you. It's 7 or 8 years ago, we were wandering through St Clement's Churchyard, and we're very interested in the First World War and in stones administered by the War Graves Commission, and just looking at the inscription, which is just a general, brief military inscription, the same as all the others. It seemed reasonably interesting, and then I wanted to look a bit further because it simply says TF/1321 Private T. Bryant, East Kent Regiment, the Buffs, 25th of August, 1914, the cross and the regimental emblem, the Buffs, the dragon, and no more than that. Well, yes, poor chap. The Buffs went over. The 1st Battalion went over to France and Flanders very early in the First World War, and were in action early on and lost a lot of people. But when I thought about it, I like to think I'm reasonably well read on the Buffs, East Kent regiments, during the First World War, and I thought straight away there were 1 or 2 discrepancies or anomalies here, because I was well aware that the Buffs didn't reach the front line at all until about the 20th or 21st of July, and I wondered how a chap in the Buffs could die and earn himself a war stone in August, unless he'd been transferred from one to the other. Or perhaps he'd been wounded abroad and was brought back. That was highly unusual. I couldn't really work it out. The army number TF/1321 signifies he was a territorial part-time soldier, Saturday night soldiers as the regulars disparagingly call them, before the war. And so almost certainly would have fallen into either the 4th or 5th Battalion of the Buffs, who certainly weren't in action anything like as early as the 1st Battalion, or even the 2nd Battalion that came home from India first. And so I had a look at the copy I've got of the First World War record of the Buffs at home, and in the back there's a long list of over 6,000 names, about 5,000 privates, and didn't see Bryant in there. There were 2 or 3 Bryants. There was a TF Bryant with a similar number, a TF number, Territorial Forces, but it wasn't the same chap. And looking in Soldiers Died, that's the published account of those who lost their lives in the First World War, arranged by a regiment, he wasn't in there at all, under any battalion. And I wasn't that surprised, because you often find these anomalies with First World War casualties, but it seemed to confirm my suspicions. I thought, well, wherever he's going to be on the local war memorial, which is just by St Peter's over there, by Market Street. And looking at that, I found he wasn't there either. Which suggested he may well have not been local. So what's he doing buried here? And what's he doing dying in August? I thought, well, I'll cheat and telephone the War Graves Commission in Maidenhead, and they said, well, we haven't got a lot on him actually. They got the card out, they weren't computerised then. They said, yes, we've got him here, buried at Sandwich, we look after the stone. But we've got that he came from and enlisted in Malvenden, in the Weald. Oh, that's interesting, so that's why I couldn't find him on the Sandwich War Memorial. And she also said, just penciled in the bottom of the card, possibly added later, it just said quite faintly, drowned. I thought, oh, that's something to be going on. Although, I thought, well, surely he didn't drown going over the other side, because I was pretty sure the BEF in the next 4.5 years got over to France and back without a single casualty, as far as the Channel was concerned. But having been given the clue of Rolvenden, Lynn and I had already transcribed that war memorial about 10 years earlier, and there he was on the list of those at Rolvenden, but not really giving us any additional information. So, well, if he's died in Sandwich and drowned, well, he's certainly buried here. A quick look at the burial register for St Clement's in 1914, and the entry was there, just as you'd expect. And there, added to it, was simply, quite apart from his name, date, etc., was drowned in the river. Just drowned in the river. A little bit more than the last time. But, oh, there's only one river in Sandwich, Stour. Presumably he's drowned in Sandwich itself. And I thought then, well, he must be, being a territorial, going back to the Buffs' history, almost certainly the 4th or the 5th Battalion, which enlisted in the Weald quite heavily. And I knew that they had moved to Dover Castle for a few days, early in August 1914, and then to Canterbury, and then to Sandwich. So I thought, we've got him. And then, of course, the ideal thing was if a chap, in the first few days of the war, with all the war fever about in the local newspapers, there might have been an account of him in the paper, even though it's rather ignominious end, perhaps. And there was. And there's a tremendous little obituary. And I'll read it to you because it just shows how wrong you can be when you look at a gravestone, particularly a military stone like that, and think of a pretty glorious death, and see what actually happened. Because on the 29th of August 1914, the headline was "Territorial Drowned at Sandwich." Thomas Bryant, 31, of Thorndon Lane, Rolvenden, was unfortunately drowned in the Stour at Sandwich about 1:30 on Tuesday morning. He was one of the 5th Territorial Battalion, the Buffs, East Kent Regiment, now stationed at Sandwich, and with other men of his regiment, had slept on the quay. That's just where you park, Dan, right down there. If you came from Fisher Gate and up the hill, as you go through the gate, on the right is the drill hall, what was the drill hall. Junk stores now. And on the left was the ship pub, now a private house. And so they slept on the quay instead of the drill hall, for the sake of coolness, for a hot August evening. And about 1:20, Private Thomas Jones of G Company woke up and, walking on the quay, missed his footing in the darkness and fell into the river. This is not our chap, this is another one. His shouts for help apparently aroused Bryant, who also fell into the river. Although there was no direct evidence, it was suggested he might have gone in with the idea of helping his comrade. P.C. Pearce, one of the Special Reserve Constables, turned his light on and managed to grab Jones's hand and, with assistance, saved him. While thus engaged, he heard the splashes caused by Bryant entering the water. The second one. Entering the water, but Bryant was carried out by the swift-running current, too far to be reached, and, fully occupied as he was with Jones, the constable was powerless to aid Bryant, whose body was found at 6:30 a.m. between the brow boat and the quay. Bryant, a fine-built fellow, was an agricultural labourer and unmarried. It then gives an explanation and description, smashing really, of the funeral. Now you can imagine, as I'm sure you're aware, of the fever, the excitement there was in this country in August 1914, with so many youngsters flocking to the colours, with the newspapers full of exhortations to flock to the colours for king and country. And so when someone dies, they really make a splash about it. But it wasn't just the paper, the military and the locals made a tremendous splash. I mean, he hadn't exactly died in action, but believe it or not, his funeral was a massive public affair, with many people lining the streets, and with the clergy of all 3 Sandwich parishes, St Clement's, St Peter and St Mary, involved, and the padre of the battalion, and the CO and the adjutant were both there, as well as the band of the Buffs regiment. And when they lowered him down here, just here, the Union Jack draped over his coffin, there were then 3 volleys fired over his grave, and last post was sounded. Terrific military funeral, with all honours. And yet, he hadn't quite had the, should we say, glorious end one imagines. In fact, it was quite different to up to nearly 1 million of his military comrades in the 1418 war, who were so many hundreds of thousands, had no grave and let alone a decent burial or a funeral, or even a few words over the grave, if they have a grave. Yet here he was, falling into the Stour, perhaps having had too many in the ship, if he and his mate were allowed in the ship on this hot evening when they fancied drink, and here he is, buried with full military honours. Of course, later on in the war, there's no such time for that. But he just happened to have died at the right time.
Two of us were here tonight, Peter. We were at the Menin Gate yesterday.
Oh, yes.
And we saw all those buffs.
Oh, yes, yes. Over 6,000 of them, yes. He won't be there because he's got a known grave. But it shows the incongruity of many of the different sorts of deaths that private soldiers, over 5,000 of the buffs alone, endured in the First World War. And of course, again, it's a salutary reminder not to jump to conclusions when you see one of our gravestones. That's right, yes. And also, don't get drunk on the quay when you're going to sleep on the edge. But follow me, we can go over anything unusual about this, but at least it does give a pretty good rundown of this particular family's misfortune in that 5 infants and 1 youth predeceased their parents. And of course, it's a sad story really. Lawrence is the name, I believe, and of course the stone wasn't put up, presumably until much later when the parents died. But they like to see their, or their relations, like to see their own children commemorated thus. Ironically, it's right opposite, I'm not sure exactly where, I made some notes a few years ago, right opposite someone who was a centenarian and born about the same time as these little infants, which again reminds us that it's a bit pot luck. It was a bit pot luck in those days who survived, and if you did survive, then you got a fortune to live longer. If you follow me, members of the society on the coach asked me if I knew the meaning of the word steen or steamed in a grave or a memorial, and it didn't ring a bell. I thought about it since, and then much later I saw the description steamed, S-T-E-E-N apostrophe D, in the description of the last resting place of a chap called William Slaughter, who's buried just over there. I don't stop at his grave, but he's one of the jurats, or councillors, of the Cinque Ports in late 18th, early 19th century. Large family of Slaughters. But if anybody here knows the meaning...
A stone. Lined with stone.
Lined with stone?
Yeah, like a well. You steam a well.
I see. Ah. You mean the grave itself? I
haven't ever seen it like that, but that is the use of the term.
Yes. Someone asked me, and I saw this later, and I don't think it was the same entry that she'd seen, so there's 2 examples. Thanks, Hal. Here we've got the grave of one of Sandwich's most famous sons, really. I'm not 100% sure that he was born here, but William Boyer was a renowned local and reasonably further afield Victorian photographer. He was responsible for a lot of the good photographs, good quality photographs that survived from late Victorian times regarding Sandwich, not just the buildings and the events, but the people and the portraits. And I thought I had a photograph of him, I haven't, but I do know that he, as photographers did in those days, and Victorians like to see their dead children photographed, as you've probably seen, photographs of little infants lying in their coffin all wrapped up, and photographed in the family keeping these cartridges eaten, sticking them in the album. He photographed his own son, dead. I think he's on here, 6 years old, I think, because, well, there's no one else to do it, I suppose. He wanted a photograph, people came to him for photographs of their children, and so there you are, and a father whose only son had died at the age of 6, and taking a photograph of him in the coffin. Seems strange to us, but in fact, I suppose, the Victorians' views of death were entirely different to ours. And so I suppose there's nothing unusual at all. I'll pass this round, an example of one of his works though. You can just pass around and let me have it back on the way somewhere. One of the many portraits or studio photographs he did take of parishioners or wandering people really, is a tinker who was photographed here in Boyer's studio in Sandwich. And it's rather nice really, because he's supposedly disabled and he's a beggar and he's trading on his disability, I suppose, because he's got a built-up shoe by something like 6 or 7 inches. But in actual fact, as the caption of the photograph says in this history, which I took the picture, his knee is 6 inches above the other one as well. So he didn't have a short leg or anything. It's almost certainly he was just one of these, begging tricks. Yeah, just got a short thigh possibly, or it's just one of those examples. One or two interesting ones over here as well. Stones, stones, and these sort of representations. But you may wonder why there aren't some, not so many, but quite a few you think would survive from the 17th century, even if they're a bit faded. And yet we rarely, if ever, in any church see a 17th century headstone with an inscription. And the reason is quite simple. There were very few, if any, 17th century headstones made and erected. There were some, of course. Far fewer than from, should we say, the middle of the 18th century. Because we must remember that in medieval times, perhaps even before medieval times, but even in medieval wills where we see testators say, I want to be buried in St Clement's Churchyard or Ash Churchyard, they did not envisage a particular plot and didn't imagine that their body would stay in a particular place ad infinitum. You look at Hyde and you see the thousands of skulls and bones taken up from the gravestone and stuck in the pit. And so here, at least though, we do have some 18th century examples involving people who lived long enough for us to be sure they originated way back in the middle of the 17th century, the time of the Commonwealth almost. And so if you had one of these in the family, somebody was dying, for example, in 1732, but aged 61, takes you way back to Commonwealth time. Marvellous. These are quite straightforward. But we also have one here, almost, well, not almost, but certainly not inscribed at the time, nor erected at the time, because this chap's died in 1690. Lovely to see an inscription of someone who's died in 1690, but added later. The stone wasn't up until, well, it was only 19 years later, so it's quite early, even for a typical 18th century one. But the body of Mr. John Martin, who died in 1719, all at the same grave, Mary Martin, his mother. That's nice. Who was married in 1690, and another one over here, which may or may not be Martin, I can't remember. But it's another early 18th century one, taking the deceased back, way back into the 17th century. These, as you can see, lying here, have been moved. And almost certainly, they've been moved from somewhere very close to the church itself. And as you guess, with not even 1% of people running to a headstone, even the 18th or early 19th century, it's almost certain that they would have been prominent parishioners. In this case, almost certainly, one can't swear, but almost certainly, this John Martin, who died in 1790, was the vicar here. It was a John Martin, vicar of St Clement's Sandwich from the late 17th to the late 17th to the early 18th century. He was vicar for 20 and 30 years, responsible for starting a couple of schools here, charity schools, and he was able to report to the Society of the Propagation of Christian Knowledge in around 1710 or 11 that he started two schools, one boys, one girls, with 25 in each, all fully clothed. When I say all fully clothed, all the clothing paid for, all with clothing, as opposed to. So nice interesting ones here. And we've got another one here, and it's a double-sided one, as it were, inscriptions on both sides. If I read this side, it simply says, here is buried William Francis Farrer, that's F-A-R-R-E-R. It's not an uncommon local name, although you can generally see it F-A-R-R-A in this area, of 7 St James's Square, London, and also of the Salutation, Sandwich. He died in 1924, etc., etc. Also, someone else, a brother, somebody Lefevre Farrer, I can't see the Christian name under the ivy. Also, Gaspard Oliver Farrer, who died April 1946, aged 85. The other one would have been Henry, actually Henry, the one I couldn't read. Lovely and pleasant, their lives together they rest. Unusual quotation really. Lovely and pleasantly they lived together they rest. These three brothers are interesting because you may be aware, I heard a little acknowledgement when I mentioned the Salutation, which of course is the magnificent Lutyen's house here in Sandwich on the corner of Knightrider Street, and so named because they knocked down an old doss house, a pub called the Salutation, on the same site in 1911. Now the connection with the Salutations, they lived there, they lived in London at a fairly grand address. They also lived here from 1911 these brothers. Lutyens, Sir Edwin Lutyens, designed the salutation. He also designed their London house. In fact, they were great friends after Lutyens designed the London house. This was in Lutyens' Indian and South African period, when he was helping Sir Herbert Baker design the government buildings in Pretoria and Cape Town, and then he himself over in New Delhi was designing the government buildings there at about the same time as the Delhi Durbar, just before the First World War. In fact, Lutyens lived in a succession of rented properties in the Edwardian period, and by 1911, having built the salutation for the Farrer family, in 1912 and 13, he moved into an address called 7 Appletree Yard, and that was also attached to 7 St James's Square, and the whole building and this annex that Lutyens lived in was owned by the Farrer family. So there's a nice double connection here with Sir Edwin Lutyens and the Farrers. But the Farrers were bankers. They were a banking family. They owned a private bank in London and were well established here locally, and they quite naturally advised a good number of local people to invest in their bank, deposit in their bank. Whether Lutyens was ever involved in this is sort of go-between, I've no idea, but the bank failed, and a good number of local people lost their savings, and the failure of that bank and the memory of the Farrer family is still remembered by some people locally, not many now I should imagine, and I better not say too much. So, of course, the salutation is worth remembering. I've got a picture of it here. You can never see it because there's a thick wall and double wooden gates in front of it. It seems to be keeps changing ownership for the last 20 years and it's empty now and again. It's been restored. But the gardens, when originally laid out, were laid out by Gertrude Jekyll, who worked in tow with Lutyens, of course, for a good many years, but past that as well. No, the gardens have not been so good for a lot of that period since Jekyll's time, but I understand, I've not seen them, but I understand they've been restored very nicely. Whether they're in the style of Jekyll.
A lot of interest now in his work again.
Yes, yes. Lynn bought a couple of Jekyll books written by her, I don't know, 60, 70, 80 years ago, on creating a garden for children. Our 2 little boys might want to, you know, when I see John in the sand, but I just can't see him following Gertrude Jekyll's. But you never know, you never know. They say patience is the thing, and don't give them the worst corner of the garden. Give them something that can dig easily and nicely, and you get them starting on some plants and flowers that grow, rather than expect them to be patient on a duck bit of ground. Yes, that's right. Yes, yes, yes. Right, that concludes St Clement's Sandwich. The next stop is Ash, and the best way is to, well, we're back to the car park. Those of you who aren't in the Guildhall car park, is follow all routes, or all through routes, out of Sandwich to the west for the A257 to Ash, Wingham and Canterbury. And
A257.
that's right, A257, Ash, Wingham, Canterbury. And the sound of the birds and the bells. Those staplers over there. Fantastic view to the south, incidentally, because this is the old, well, not necessarily Roman road, but the old road from Sandwich to Canterbury, Ash and Wingham, Littlebourne, and this is on one of the highest places on that road, and certainly the highest place north and south. So it's a very high brow, and the church is right at the top of it, and quite a distinctive landmark, obviously, very similar to Wingham Church. Well, I did mention to some of the others that one of the graves, I pointed out only briefly, was the Victorian licensee of the Green Man, which is these days the awful Frog and Orange, which has changed its name, like many other these nonsensical ideas. But that's Henry Alphonsus Setterfield. And just the other side of transept here are a good number of Solly graves. Well, Solly is a very local name. All round here, Sandwich, Woodnesborough, Ash, Wingham. Very, very common indeed, both for sort of agricultural labourers and also for quite senior people in the parishes. A good number of those as well have their wills have not only survived but have been transcribed by transcribed in Archaeologia Cantiana a good few years ago, and there's some very, very interesting descriptions of the parish and the church, and bequests for the various lights and lanterns and candles and prayers for their soul as far back to the 13th and 14th century. But this is the one I want to talk about mostly tonight at Ash, because I'm not sure which of those two pedestals. Henry. That's Henry. Right. Well, his cross is gone by the look of it, fallen off, which is a shame. This is the Vicar of Ash. He came here quite as a young man in his 30s, about 38, in 1857. He was, I went to Oxford, all the rest of it. DNB, haven't got that here. He came here as vicar, or technically the last perpetual curate, but he's always referred to as the Vicar of Ash. He was here from 1857 until he died 11 years later in 1868. Just a typical country vicar. He also, as a little sideline, again, which country vicars tended to do so, certainly in the middle of the 19th century, he acted as a crammer for those who'd gone through Eton and either weren't making university or Sandhurst or whatever, and needed a bit of a leg up to the old grey cells. They were the sons of the aristocracy, the nobility, but weren't exactly scholars, and they'd come here, not just here, but they'd come to Henry Mackiness, not always just as a boy either. Never mind, I'll shout. They'd come here as late as 18, 19, 20, 21 even, which does surprise me, but I can prove that very many of the people who passed through his hands were in their late teens or later. Some of the people who passed through his hands, for example, were at least two sons, probably three, of the sons of the Duke of Beaufort from Gloucestershire, badminton. At least one of the Methuen brothers, who eventually became a field marshal and was captured twice in the Boer War. Another chap who was the son, two of the sons of a chap called Roger, who bought Hadlow Castle in the 1850s or 60s. And I ought to mention one thing. While he was here, a year before he died, Henry Mackiness, that's his name I ought to say, because you can't see it, Henry Mackiness, he was involved in a terrific scandal, which really was a cause célèbre as far as the local papers are concerned, the Kentish Gazette certainly. If you look at the Kentish Gazette, for example, in October-November 1867, you'll see that the title, Wingham Petty Sessions, and the subtitle, A Nobleman and a Clergyman Charged with Assault. At the Petty Sessions held here today before Mr. Diath and a full bench of magistrates, an extraordinary assault case was heard. A complaint was made by Mr. Albert George Usher, auctioneer, Canterbury, against Lord Arthur Somerset, the Reverend H.S. Mackiness, Vicar of Ash, and Mr. Roger, a pupil of the Reverend gentleman. In fact, they were both pupils, the other two. That on the 25th of September, they did unlawfully assault and beat him to the serious injury of his person. The case against Mr. Mackiness was first heard, and that gentleman, on being called upon, pleaded not guilty. Now it then goes on to outline the case and what happened. Briefly, what had caused all this was that a fairly well-known and substantial family living in the street, a middle-aged couple, had separated. They'd become estranged. But the chap had moved away, the lady was still living in the parish. He came back by arrangement with his wife into the parish to take some of his own possessions away from the house when they agreed that the wife wouldn't be there. However, some sort of disagreement must have arisen, or something must have come to the notice of the vicar that he thought this husband shouldn't be in the house and shouldn't be picking up some of these possessions, because the vicar, with many of the pupils in his charge, these sons of the nobility, he rounded up his gang and marched along the street and challenged Mr. Usher. In fact, when the door came open, or when they burst the door open and saw Mr. Usher there with his assistant, Mackiness, as witness on both sides, said, "There he is, seize him." Whereupon his gangsters, thugs, literally seized him and tipped him over, really, thumped him black and blue, beat him up, left him staggering out of the house with a cut lip, a cut eye, and then going down on his knees and falling unconscious. That's the Vicar of Ash for you, and his his illustrious charges that he was educating the sons of the nobility and the aristocracy. In fact, a few days later, he was found not guilty. Not surprisingly, when you see some of the things that were said in his defence, and when you think the whole case eventually moved towards prosecuting just one of the boys, for a very minor assault, and he couldn't hardly even remember hitting him, and they just put it down to his excitement. Mackiness got off scot-free, and so did the son of nobility, poor little Roger, who was only the son of a Kentish gentry. He was fined £2, that was his punishment, just 40 shillings fine. I've had a discussion, I was pleased to discover this because Liz Hudson, one of the two eminent local historians, hadn't spotted it, and I brought it to her notice, and she disagrees with it. She thinks, oh no, he was all right, the Vicar of Ash. She agrees with the leader in the newspaper the next week that just said it was a fuss over nothing, really. Whereas I think, especially with the people who are defending him, and the way they put it, and I'll happily pass this round to you to read in the car, I think he got off, and they wangled him out of it, really, and he got out of jail, as it were. Only a year later, he died, which was a great shame. I'll just mention also the headline, in the leader, which sided with Mackiness, of course. Simply, a new development of muscular Christianity. He only died a year later, and as usual they say, great is the sadness in the community and all the rest of it when he died. I think I've got a couple of bits we made on a course with me. No, only a very brief one. He mentioned the value of the living, how long he'd been there, what he'd done as a sideline, as extra income, he'd taken in these boys. It didn't mention the thing which to me makes him the most notable and why he's my hero, because I just happen to be, it so happens I'm self-appointed archivist and historian of the local cricket club at Ash, for whom I play, and I've dug about a bit, and it's quite clear that when he came here, Henry Mackiness revived cricket in Ash. He reformed the cricket club. Of course, he was captain, opening batsman, chairman, and all the rest of it, secretary, treasurer, I've no doubt. But he got some really good fixtures going up against the local grammar school in Sandwich, against the well-established Sandwich club itself, against Minster, against Moncton, against Woodnesborough, one or two schools in Ramsgate. He gave his lads a good game of cricket. He had a very, very good side because 3 or 4 of his boys had been through Eton, perhaps more than that. He'd been through Eton himself. He'd played for Eton's second 11, no mean status. 2 or 3 of his boys had played for Eton firsts or seconds, and at least two of the boys that went through him and played for Ash went on to play for Kent. He also was instrumental in making sure that all the local businesses in the street closed at 5 o'clock. At 5 o'clock. Closed at 5 o'clock on a Tuesday afternoon, especially so all the boys, young men who worked in the shops, could get along to Mollen Meadow and play cricket and practice cricket, which he thought was just as important as working in the shops, even as important as coming to church perhaps. He did a grand job keeping cricket going in Ash, revived it. Not long after he died, it subsided again, to be revived again in the 70s and 80s, then it subsided again and was reformed at the turn of the century, again by the local vicar, who, once again, in 1900, at the time of the Boer War, was captain, chairman, opening batsman. It's lovely to see scorecards, though, that I've got from the Kentish Gazette in the 50s and 60s, where he's got this side together, and he's always the first batsman there. I noticed one of the other batsmen there at one time was the Vicar of Ickham. I didn't know he was the Vicar of Ickham, but it was the Reverend someone or other, and in Crockford's it points him to the Vicar of Ickham. He also went through Eton, so you might have known him from school days. One thing which I'm trying to prove, haven't yet done so as far as cricket records or statistics are concerned, but for which I have 2 completely independent claims, and that is that he and 2 of his boys, the Somerset, the sons of the Badminton Company, actually wangled W.G. Grace to come here and play cricket for Ash. It has survived in oral tradition in the club, which shocked me, I only heard that this year at the AGM. But before that, 7 or 8 years ago, when going through the card index of the details and publications and cuttings on ash at the Beanie Library in Canterbury, I found a reference. Well, I found a reference to some correspondence between a cricket statistician back in 1966 writing to the librarian at the Beanie. That's all right. We had a lot more. I found this card which mentioned correspondence between a chap in the West Country writing to what's his name? He's dead now. The librarian at the Beanie at the time in the 60s. His name would come to Mr. Higginbottom. Yes, saying, "I am trying to compile a complete record of all the runs scored by W.G. Grace in minor cricket, not all his first class or tester." And he apparently scored 80,000 first-class runs. I've got nearly 20,000 runs in minor cricket. I only need a few more to get him to 100,000. Now, I have heard that he once played for Ash in Kent. I thought then, this is interesting, but there is another Ash. And can you help me? Is it possible? Well, Mr. Higginbottom wrote back and said, well, the local paper might tell you all the rest of it. But the account he'd come across was an article written in a journal called, I hope I remember it, because you may have heard of it yourself. Would you believe it? Well, anyway, the article was called 40 Years of Turf and Stage. 40 Years of Turf and Stage. Written by a chap in his 60s or 70s who'd been interested, obviously, in racing and may well have been involved as a thespian. But he said, and I only have the quotation from what this chap said in his letter, he said, I went to Eton and then I went to Ash after school, and I went to Ash and I was educated by Mr. Mackaness, the vicar there, in the 1860s. And this chap was born in Christmas Eve 1850, so he went to Ash when he was 15. Sugden, his name. The Looking Glass, that's the name of the journal. If anyone's ever heard of a magazine called The Looking Glass, please tell me. He said, what a cricket team we had at Ash in those days. Mr. Mackaness had played for Eton, so had Roger played for Eton, and they were instrumental in getting W.G. Grace and his brother, E.M. Grace, to play for us at Ash. He doesn't say, he said they were practising nearby at the time. Whether he meant practising as a doctor or cricket, he doesn't say. I don't know. I think it's almost certain that they were there for Canterbury Cricket Week, which is a very big social occasion from the 1840s onwards. And I've looked at all the accounts of Canterbury Cricket Week, and any cricket going along in this area, both in the Mercury and the Gazette at the time, can't see a thing. Doesn't mean that they say it wasn't, but I can't see a thing. Yes? Go on, please.
University library, because I did this a couple of years ago and I had to actually look up, and I'm not at all interested in cricket.
How dare you?
I've actually got quite a lot of old cricket books and stuff.
Oh yes, well that's worth having a look. I mean, I've got a reasonable cricket library myself, but it's you know, well, about 100 books on, mostly on history of cricket. But I'll certainly, no, honestly, I'll have a look there. May well, particularly Kentish. Yes, thank you.
I remember reading quite a lot of stuff about W.G. Grace.
Yes. Oh, no, that's interesting. Yeah.
It was 2 years ago.
I will have a
because
look.
I'm not interested, it didn't go.
Yes, yes, yeah. Well, that'd be fascinating. I'm keep meaning to get in touch. I think the historian who wrote to the Beanie in '66 is probably dead now, because he must have spent his whole life finding these 20,000 runs. But I do know he's published his work, because I've seen it in bibliographies, various cricket tomes. Just a case of getting hold of someone in the Association of Cricket Statisticians, or to get hold of Bill Frindle or someone when the next test match is on. But I found that fascinating. But this oral tradition in the club, which I only found about this year, and I interviewed a chap in his 70s or 80s who used to play for the club just after the war, and he says his father told him, and this is the chap who still farms Molland Meadow, when I know that we were using it in the 1860s, and he said yes, and he thought it was one of the local doctors got hold of him, and he would have, I think he would have imagined it W.G. Grace in his dotage, big fat, beard and all the rest of it. But W.G. Grace, as an 18, 19, 20, 21-year-old, was just becoming the greatest cricketer there'd ever been, but it wasn't quite yet so. His brother E.M., a doctor, was more famous. But by the early 70s, Grace was certainly the non-pareil, as they called him, and spent the next 30 years as being the best. One other, what was I going to say about the W.G. Grace? Oh yes, and there's one other reason why I think it might, I mustn't say must be true, but it might be true, and as to why he came here, quite apart from only being 7 or 8 miles away during Canterbury Cricket Week when there were balls going on and all sorts of theatricals going on, the old stages for example. But also, I now find that the Duke of Beaufort at Badminton in Gloucestershire was a personal friend of the father of W.G. Grace, who was also a surgeon. And I also know that the three of the sons of the Duke of Beaufort, Lord Somerset and Lord others, were contemporaries of W.G. Grace, almost certainly knew each other, not from school obviously, but knew each other locally, and that one of these, one of W.G. Grace's brothers, who stayed in Gloucestershire, wasn't much of a cricketer, but rode to hounds with a Beaufort hunt regularly, 3 or 4 times a week, all his life, from early age, all his life. So there's no doubt to me that the Duke of Beaufort's family and his sons knew the Graces before they were famous and knew them well. And I see no reason why if W.G. Grace is coming here to Canterbury 4 or 5 times in the late 60s and early 70s, when there's terrific interest, and knowing perhaps that these friends of his are only 5 or 6 miles away, mad on cricket, and playing for a chap who had influence and, you know, knew cricket himself. Well, as it happens, we're going anyway. So. Oh no, just to show you a nice little grave over here, which David will be pleased about, because those of you who heard my talk a few years ago on tracing the history and the occupants of the house in the past, you'll know that David's family used to live in 1839, and he's buried here in Ash. The couple who built the house that David's family lived in for a couple of generations, several decades, at Shackley. All I'll mention is he was baptised here in Ash, he married here in Ash, and he's buried here in Ash. But again, when you look at a stone like that, you think, oh, there's an Ash man born and bred all his life. He hardly ever lived here. He may have grown up in Ash as a young boy, but he married a Deal girl. He lived all his adult life in Deal. He was a saddler, and he lived in Lower Street, nowadays part of High Street, and ran a saddlery business for over 40 years, and his son did after him. His son stayed there, buried here, although he died in Hastings. His wife was an Adkins, Valentine Bush married an Annie Adkins. Of course, there are a lot of Bushells around here, but there were 2 Valentines, and one of the publicans near Nonnington was a Valentine Bushell a bit earlier, and all sorts of Adkinses and Bushells. But anyway, we'll move off towards Woodnesborough. Now, if you don't know Woodnesborough, just across there, don't worry, in whatever way you like, turn the car round, go back down the street the way you came, and after only 100 yards or so, when there's a field on your right after the houses, there's a fork off to the right, that's New Street. Take that right-hand fork, so you're not going out on the main road to Mash. Take that right-hand fork, it winds around for about a mile, and you come to a crossroads, left to Sandwich. You've just gone through the hamlet of Marshborough, left to Sandwich, but go straight over, and you're in Woodnesborough. And very soon after that, you have Woodnesborough Church on your left, from the mushroom dome on the top. So turn right at New Street, only 100 yards or so down the main road. Go on for a mile or so through Marshborough, crossroads, straight over. Woodnesborough Church is on your left. The parking's a bit easier. Okay, see you there. Yeah, the best thing to get into the next place is follow, rather than me give instructions. If you all follow, because we've got to get across 2 or 3 couple of roads, haven't we?
Well, you're going to have to go
Like
left. You'll have to go
left, right, Felderland Lane,
and then through Felderland Lane, and then
across the. That's not too bad, is it?
road.
Right, we've made it all then. Well, we're here to look principally, only really, at this grave, this monument to. Well, it's the monument to many members of the Gillow family, G-I-L-L-O-W. Without question, they were the most prominent, substantial, one of the largest families in Woodnesborough in the 19th century. If anything was happening around here, the Gillows were involved. They were farmers. They farmed here. They farmed at Marshborough, the little hamlet we've just gone through, the skew-width bit of road. They also were active in Sandwich. They owned the East Kent Brewery. So they were brewers and farmers, and as usual, because they were senior members of the parish, they were involved in the usual philanthropy and do-gooding and the rest of it. The reason we're here is because by the 1870s there were 3 generations of Gillows still in the parish, including a family of 10 brothers and sisters, and one of those 10 came to a sticky end in April 1878. We've just been to Ash and seen the gravestone of a perpetrator of some violence, in my opinion. We're now here to see the grave of the victim of some violence, because in the 1870s, 40 or 50 years after the swing disturbances in 1830 in East Kent, which had spread all over the country, the so-called last labourers' revolt, if you like, the disturbances against the threshing machines, which involved rick burning and machine wrecking in East Kent and the rest of the country in 1830, that was put down so violently that rural dissent still continued in a haphazard way in the 30s, 40s and 50s until there came a depression. But one still saw rural dissent of a sort in the 1870s and 80s, a bit of rick burning, a bit of machine wrecking, although at this very time, in the 1870s and 80s, Joseph Arch was going around the country trying to muster up numbers for his new agricultural union. But on the 4th of April 1878 occurred an incident in this parish, very close to the crossroads, just the other side of the crossroads that we've just come across, when one of the Gillow family was murdered. Earlier, or a few days earlier, one of the labourers working for the Gillow family had expressed openly his discontent at the taking on of machinery by the Gillow family to be used on the farm for threshing, just as back in 1830, but also for ploughing, as a typical steam plough of the time, ones we'd seen in America sort of 10 or 20 years before. And he didn't think much of it. And it's believed that it was him that one night damaged the machinery in his frustration. And so the following day, Captain William Gillow, the farmer, asked one of his sons to watch out. The son he chose was Arthur. And Arthur was watching out for whoever was going to come along and tamper with the machinery the next night. And along he came and smashed the machinery up despite the efforts of Arthur Gillow. And because one supposes he'd been recognised by Arthur Gillow, he set about Arthur Gillow as well and smashed him to bits with a bit of heavy machinery. Arthur Gillow was murdered, and his body was found in the road the following morning, and as you can imagine, it caused a tremendous outcry, a big shock. The rumours going around the parish that one of the Gillow family had been murdered. It wasn't long before a chap called Gambrill, this labourer, was picked up, Stephen Gambrill, picked up locally and charged. And we can see from the Kentish Gazette at the time what a coarse celebrity it was in the area in 1878. Just to read you a line or so while the light still holds with us. There was a report, for example, the murder of Mr. Gillow. The prisoner, Gambrill, was taken before the magistrates yesterday and on the application of the police was remanded on suspicion. He was conveyed in the course of the afternoon to St. Augustine's jail, where he now lies, progressing as favourably towards recovery as can be expected. Now that's the supposed murder, progressing towards recovery, so see why in a minute. The police are still making most active inquiries, and it is said they have procured very strong evidence against Gambrill, who will be brought before the justices again on Friday. Well, I can see the newspapers were allowed to say a lot more that wasn't, as far as they were concerned, sub judice at the time, more than papers can today, officially. The excitement in the neighbourhood has scarcely abated, and the confirmation of the report that the deceased's throat had been cut, in addition to his other injuries, has not tended to lessen the feeling against the perpetrator of the murder. They don't actually say it as Gambrill, but they're not far off it. I can hand you around a photograph of the wrecked machinery, and also on the other side, in fact there's a caption underneath the photograph, which I've cut off because it does say that Richard Gillow was the one murdered. Richard was a brother of Arthur, but Arthur was the one murdered. In fact, amazing, one of the Sutton, what do you call the publishers, Alan Sutton, their History of Sandwich in Photographs actually captions it Richard Gillow that was murdered, but that's wrong. Sandwich Cricket Club have got it right in their history, because these Gillows were terrific cricketers. They could easily put out. They really were. They weren't as good as Sussex cricketers, of course. They could put out 11 Gillows, just like today around in this area. The Laslets can put out 11 cricketers and 11 hockey players. The Gillows could put out 11 Gillows. At least 5 or 6 played against Ash in one fixture, and 2 went on to play for Kent in 30, 40 years on and off for Kent. No, why did I mention cricket? I've forgotten now.
You said sandwich.
Oh, that's right, yes. Yes, Sandwich Street Club got the history right. They said it was art, it was murder, and they're quite right. Just very briefly there's a very, very long report in here, which again, you're welcome, I forgot to give you the other one in the car, but you're welcome to look at this in the car as you go along. Some suspicion appears from the first to have been directed towards Gambrel, as he was known to have left Sandwich on Wednesday only a few minutes in advance of Mr. Gillow. When the police made their appearance in the morning, Gambrel was at work on the farm, but was taken ill and left for his home, where he has a wife and family. He had a little kiddie of 5 and a boy of 5 and a girl of 2. Thence he made his way to Sandwich, but was fetched back to be questioned. His house lies half a mile from the road in the direction of the marshes, and he told several that he did not take the high road on Wednesday night, but went home through the fields. A broken stick, almost exactly similar to that found beside the murdered gentleman, was discovered in the marshes through which Gambrel had to pass, and was believed to belong to him, all very circumstantial. His explanation of this was that he snapped it in cleaning mud from his boots after his walk and threw it away. He was not at first detained, but his movements were watched, and his cottage was searched. In the afternoon he again made his way to Sandwich, and a mounted constable went after him and took him into custody on suspicion. He was conveyed to the Sandwich police station and placed in the reception room to await the arrival of a superior officer. Gambrel lay down on a bench and covered himself over with a rug, which the constable gave him. The constable directly afterwards pulled the rug off him, and then found that he had attempted to commit suicide by cutting his throat, so that's why he's recovering. He had succeeded in making a dreadful gash in his throat with his pocket knife. Dr. Scott was called in and he sewed up the wound. Gambrel is detained in the lockup and will be brought before the magistrates as soon as he is sufficiently recovered. As you can imagine, there's also a very, very long account of the inquest in the paper, where all the witnesses, not of the murder, but the witnesses of the circumstances over the day or so, gave their accounts in graphic detail, as usually with Delasso, who was the coroner, that we see covering all this. I might as well hand it out. If anybody wants to read it in the car, they're very welcome. Also didn't mention when I was at Ash, I've got, it's on the back of that. No, it's not. Oh yes, there. What have I got on the other side of there? Oh, yeah, the threshing machine. On the back of the threshing machine is the murderer, or at least the chap who swung for it. Stephen Gambrel of Marshborough here, Woodnesborough, was hanged Pennant Heath. No, beg your pardon, not at Pennant Heath, but Maidstone Jail later on in 1878 by Marwood, a famous executioner who came to Maidstone. It's believed to be Marwood's first execution at Maidstone. Apparently he was a bit of a perfectionist, he liked everything to be just so, but they all were like that. The other chap, Pierpoint and the rest of them, because, well, the chap went more quickly if they got everything in balance and the weight and everything right. So there's the chap. He had a 5-year-old and a 2-year-old, and this was taken by Boyer, whose grave I showed you in Sandwich, in his studio, and taken not long before the murder. So we've got quite a good description of the chap who did it, or at least who was hanged for it, so by all means. Oh, and past this, what I didn't tell you when I was at Ash about Mackiness, didn't get a chance of what was going on above. Only yesterday I've managed to get out of the British Museum, the British Library now, copies of 2 unsigned, the artist is unknown, watercolour sketches of the cricket field at Ash, at Mollen Meadow, all prepared for a game of cricket, and also another one showing cricket in action on Mollen Meadow in Ash. I can't bring the originals out that they've sent me because to me they're too valuable. I don't want to lose them. Because I left them in the car or something. I don't mind the car being lost, but they weren't that cheap. And so you're welcome to have a look at those. They're on each side. Of Gambrel, yes. So, as I say, that was quite a sensational thing here in 1878. Astonishingly, when people were beginning to knuckle under, there was nothing new about machinery coming to the farm in the late 1870s in this area. The threshing machines have been reintroduced really in the 30s or 40s after they sort of voluntarily dismantled them in 1830, 1831. But with the recession of the 40s and 50s, or the 40s anyway, back they came. and the 60s were better for farming in this part of Kent. The 70s with a terrific lot of very bad harvests because of the bad weather in the 70s, and then the import of cheap grain and hops from the continent. The 80s were a very bad time for farming in this county, and so you see unemployment created by new machinery brought in, and the labourers' frustrated reaction to it.
Are these gillows related to the gillows of Faversham?
Gillows was from Faversham. I can't swear to it, but I seem to remember I was in this churchyard and actually saw another grave somewhere, and it gave both Faversham and here.
Yeah, they have the hook split.
Oh, I see. Yes. Yeah. No, it's not a rare name. Are there? Yes.
And if they have a lot of sons, they are probably...
Well, quite possibly. So it was 10 of them.
Like the Sladdens, you know,
Yes.
the Sladdens were married all over the place,
Yes.
weren't they?
Richard, Arthur, William. I'll tell you nothing about these cricketers. They're good chaps. They were really good ringers. What, you know, the sort of people that play for anybody. In those days, a village club didn't have a game every Saturday. They got up a game several times in the summer. It took some preparing. But these gillows, especially 2 or 3 of them, they would play for Ash, play for Minster, play for everybody. I think I mentioned that before, but they would. They'd play with all the villages around here just to get a game. Yeah, great chat. Right, follow us to Worth.
The murderer.
Oh, the murderer.
Well, the one who was hanged.
Very good. Don't forget this was the murderer.
It's very impressive seeing you all snaking along behind me with the lights on, going slowly. There's so many crossroads to sort of ski with.
I'm not going back that way. It's a shortcut.
We're almost at Sandwich now.
It was,
actually.
we got here before you.
Yes, we're very close to Sandwich. Yeah, very close. Just that last road we cut across, it goes straight in there. Well, here we are at Worth. One thing I didn't mention while we were at... Oh, we've got some more to come. One thing I didn't mention is poor old Arthur Gillow was murdered, but in fact on his tombstone, his death is simply related to his met a sudden death. That's all it says, met a sudden death. It was rather sudden, I suppose. All here, or any more? Did I hear or see somebody?
There's one more coming.
Coming up, right.
Another one over there, I think. Oh, more coming.
Oh, right. Last 2 big Pauline. Simple as that. Well, it's just about kept light, and the rain's kept off. That's good.
Getting cloudy, but it's supposed to.
Well done. Here we are at Worth, or Wordinworth, as often known, and very often the parish is simply called Word, W-O-R-D, or Worth, and very often, I think these days, they often call it Wordinworth, to make it more twee. Well, we're here. Now, this is the last churchyard tonight, and you're only going to get one tombstone here as well, I'm afraid. So I brought you all this way just to see one stone, but this is my favourite, and as far as I know, there's no cricket connection. So, in fact, only the other day I was passing along the main road just outside Worth, and thought, oh, I'll just check that my favourite hasn't been moved, or it's still there, although I know where to find it when you're all following me, and I couldn't find it. Don't worry, I found it after a few minutes going round and round. They'd moved it, and I'll show you how and why in a moment. So whose name is on this stone? The answer is nobody. Oh, he's brought us all the way. Nobody's on it at all. And it used to be, as far as I can recall, the last time I saw it, just about here, in this little gap near the Garden of Remembrance. Not very big, not much sort of higher or taller than the footstones that we see, which might be about there. It's about there, no more than that. And at an angle, almost 45 degrees, so obviously it was sinking. And what I never realised, that quite a lot of it, should have done really, it's obvious, quite a lot of it was underneath the ground, perhaps half or more. So it never was really a small one, but an average size. And in fact, it was there, but I found it behind this tree, and it's leaning up against the wall there with a fairly standard pedestal. But I'll read you what it says on it. It's getting dark now.
Have you got a light, boy?
I've got a light.
Here lies the grave of an unknown body washed ashore here at Worth. In fact, when I found this, I suppose it must be 5 or 6 years ago now, I was quite excited because I'd done not some research, but just some ordinary reading on the disaster of the North Fleet going down in Hythe Bay, or the East Bay, in the 1870s. And it really is quite a graphic story. In fact, if you look at the parish register for Worth, for a few days after the disaster, in fact early February, 3rd of February, there were 2 entries on the 3rd of February. The body of a man, abode found on the seashore. 3rd of February, obviously a dash for the age. And the next entry also, the body of a woman, found on the seashore, February the 3rd, just a dash for the age. So in fact 2 were found and buried, or 2 were buried on the same day. But only one is actually, it only describes one. I don't know why. Funny enough, when I'd seen that inscription there and checked up in the Worth burial register, I, obviously careless, as one shouldn't be, I only saw the one for the woman, and it was only when I went back to photocopy it a year or so later that I saw there were 2 entries, the one above as well. So I've always assumed from the earliest that that's a woman, because I only saw the original entry. So it may not be a woman, presumably it's 2. But there they are, buried there. And now this was a terrific disaster, one of the biggest maritime disasters in Victorian times. You may all be familiar with the Princess, what was it, Princess Louise was it, or Princess Alice, the great big packet that foundered in the Thames estuary going from London to Margate or back. Bank holiday crowd of hundreds went down there. This was not that dissimilar in its effect on Victorian society at the time, via the media, such as it was then, of course, because what happened was a wooden 3-masted steamer was leaving, no, not a steamer, no, a wooden 3-masted, what do we call her? A vessel, yes, more of a schooner, a vessel anyway, with nearly 400 on board, 397 people on board, 393 people on board, most of them emigrant families bound for Australia, in particular Tasmania. And the vessel itself had been chartered by the contractors for the Tasmanian Railway Company, who were bringing out hundreds of emigrant families, the man to do the work and build the railway, and the main cargo, in fact, in the hold, were the railway irons, the main metal for the railway that was going to be laid. So they were bringing out the railway, and the men who were going to lay it, and their families, so emigrating to Australia. It left on the 19th, it left on the 20th, it left Gravesend. The vessel was called the North Fleet. It was made in Northfleet. It left near Northfleet near Gravesend, and met with very heavy weather between Whitstable and Thanet, so around Herne Bay, Reculver, I suppose, offshore there, and hove to, anchored off the North Foreland for the night of the 21st. The next day it met even worse weather coming around the corner. It was in the channel for getting on for a day, but not getting very far. It must have come through the Downs at Deal, here, between the shore and the Goodwin Sands. But when it got as far as off Romney Marsh, just east of Dungeness Peninsula, off Hythe, 3 miles offshore, decided to anchor for the night of the 21st. No, the night of the 22nd. The captain, Mr. Knowles, decided to anchor, along with something like up to 200 other vessels, all ashore. You often find 500 or 600 vessels sheltering the Downs in the 18th and 19th century. The Great Storm of 1703, for example, which meant to kill 8,000 people. Most of those died in vessels in the Downs. So it anchored 3 miles offshore in the East Bay on the 22nd. But at 10:30, there was a terrific gale, of course, that's why they couldn't get any further. A terrific gale, a noisy storm, howling wind, but at 10:30, the lookout spotted, coming straight for the North Fleet, a large steamer coming out of the dark.